Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Steven Mithen. Steven is a professor of early prehistory in the Department of Archaeology at the University of Reading. He has previously been the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Reading. He has a bachelor's in prehistory and archaeology from Sheffield University, a master's in biological computation from York University, and a PhD in archaeology from Cambridge University. He's also been a fellow of the British Academy since 2004. His main research areas are in late Pleistocene and early Holocene hunter-gatherers and evolution of the human mind. He is the author of numerous books, including the most recent, The Language Puzzle, piecing together the 6 million year story of how words evolved. It is fantastic. It is a fantastic book on language. Language is super complicated, and he gives just a tremendous story of the evolutionary story of where did language begin with the earliest common ancestor all throughout the different human species up to our own Homo sapiens. And it is a kind of a tour de force, so it's a wonderful read. We start by talking about what is the language puzzle. He gives an excellent overview of human evolution, which I greatly enjoyed. We talk about the importance of bipedalism and some of the fossil record gaps. We talk about different human species and how some of them lived together on the Earth at the same time. We talk about how language works, both in terms of phonemes, and we talk about kind of the physiology of it and in our actual esophagus and our throat and the larynx and all that. It's very, very interesting. We talk about the origins and spread of different languages, even including quote unquote dead languages and ones that are still alive, and how so many different languages are rapidly disappearing, which is a kind of an issue. We also talk about the neurology of language, how it works in the brain, language evolving over time, language connected with thinking and emotions, the future of language, and many other topics. Again, I really love this conversation. Tremendously fascinating, and he does such a wonderful job in the book and in the conversation of describing the evolutionary story of language. So it's just absolutely wonderful. Of course, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So if you like this conversation, get over there, subscribe, share with your friends, tell folks about it. And also check out some of the other conversations I've had. I mentioned some of the previous people I've talked to on the podcast, sort of in this space with this topic. So there's many other conversations and episodes to kind of mine and kind of see the links there. And so now I bring you Steven Mithen. I'm here with Steven Mithen. Steven, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yes, of course. You've written a fabulous book, which I greatly enjoyed. That book is called The Language Puzzle, piecing together the 6 million year story of how words evolved. It's out through the wonderful basic books, and we'll talk all about it. Before we do, could you tell listeners just kind of who you are professionally, academically, all the important, relevant details about you?
Okay, thanks. Yes, well, as Xavier says, my name's Steven Mithen. I'm a Professor of Early Prehistory at the University of Reading in the UK. So by profession, I'm an archaeologist, and I undertake quite a bit of field work in southern Jordan and in Scotland on hunter-gatherers. But I'm also interested in the big questions about evolution of language, music, mind, society, and so forth. And for those questions, I need to step outside of my own discipline of archaeology and draw on other disciplines that are relevant: anthropology, in this case, linguistics, psychology, a bit of philosophy. So I try to work at the juncture between several disciplines, which anybody has to do, really, if you want to think about these really big questions of how humans came to be the way we are today.
Yeah, that's the wonderful thing about the book is that it does a lot of the stuff that I really really enjoyed. Actually, is it talks a lot about the history of humans, kind of deep history, and our common ancestors, and maybe the precursors to Homo sapiens, and then it starts talking about the kind of specifics and mechanics of language, and then it really gets into many different territories. Just like you're saying, all this kind of intersections of psychology or cognitive science or genetics or neurology or things like that. And so language is still kind of at the heart of all those
Yeah.
things, but it's really nice how you kind of touch into all of these different areas.
It's a very risky thing to do because you can never really be more than master of your own discipline, and even your own discipline, there's lots of different views. So when you're trying to actually extract what you think are the important things from research in neuroscience or from genetics, it's always quite risky and very demanding. But I think if you don't try to do that, have that ambition to do that, we're never really going to get to grips with these big questions about language or mentality and so forth.
I certainly agree with that. I think it's very very important to for a while we had people kind of in their groups and every people were studying and doing their thing
Yeah.
out and they're kind of they're part of the office or the academy or whatever, and no one ever talked to each other. So now you get all these groups together. People start to disciplines talk to each
Yeah,
other.
that's right.
We need that stuff. So
Yeah,
that's
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 right.
super important. So the book is the language puzzle, and you sort of talk about it in the beginning. I guess the question is, what is the language puzzle, right? What
Okay.
is it about language for at least for us as humans, and what is this? What is this puzzle that's so language is so deeply fascinating, incredibly complicated, especially in the brain. What's the puzzle?
Well, I think in my mind, there's sort of three puzzles. Now, the first one is, as you say, language is such a complicated process. Involve the brain, the vocal tract, the body, gesture. It's a whole body-brain experience. And yet we do it effortlessly. We're speaking to each other now. We're making up sentences that nobody's ever uttered before. We're not really thinking about the words. They're just coming into our mind. They're tumbling out. But you can understand what I'm saying. I can understand what you're saying. It's almost miraculous that we do that so effortlessly when we know that behind all of that, there's such complexity going on. And the great puzzle is, how on earth are we managing it? And that puzzle is then magnified because if we look at our closest living relatives, the great apes, chimpanzees and gorillas and so forth, they don't really have anything remotely like language. And yet, if we look at other distinguishing aspects of humanness, like walking in two legs or using tools or in living in quite complex societies with diverse social relationships, we can see all those foundations very clearly in the great apes. And we think they're also likely in the common ancestor. But there seems to be a gulf in the nature of our language and the sort of vocalizations that chimpanzees and great apes and presumably the common ancestor uses. So that's another bit of a puzzle. How on earth was that gulf bridged in human evolution? And then the puzzle that I really focus on in this book is what we were talking about earlier. If you're going to try to answer these questions, you've got to draw on lots of different disciplines. You've got to draw on archaeology and anthropology for what happened during evolution. You've got to draw on linguistics for what the nature of language actually is. You've got to draw on neuroscience, what's happening in the brain. You've got to draw a little bit on child development for how children acquire language, and then genetics. But of course, all these disciplines are vast in themselves. So somehow we've got to find the right bits from each of those disciplines that are relevant to language, and then try to work out how we piece them together. So it's finding the right bits, piecing them together. So it's like doing a really complex jigsaw. And hopefully at the end of that, you will get some sort of picture emerging from that of how language evolved and how it operates in the brain today. So it's almost like a hierarchy of puzzles. Some are the big questions, and some is the methodology of how to answer it. And I see it very much trying to piece together a puzzle. Language, evolution language, has been addressed for many, many years, but predominantly it was done by, say, an archaeologist writing just from the archaeological point of view, And as soon as a linguist comes along and say, well, that's not actually how language works. Or a linguist was writing from a linguist point of view, an archaeologist would come along and say, well, that's not how evolution works. So the challenge is to put all the right bits of the puzzle together. And that's what I try to do in my book. And then at the end, I tried to say, well, this is the picture that I see. I think some bits of that are probably right. There's still some missing pieces in there, which hopefully future research can try to add at a later date. But the big puzzle is, how on earth do we do it? How on earth are we having this conversation? It's remarkable. And we should never forget that sort of fascinating, remarkable, wonderful thing that we're doing when we're communicating with the language.
Oh yes. I mean, it's every day. I mean, it's quite the marvel that people can communicate so easily.
Yeah.
It's really, really. We take it for granted, but I mean, it is quite a marvel. So I really enjoyed. I mean, your very kind of overview of basically how we got to humans. So. You don't have to do that here. I guess the most relevant bit I want to ask is, I mean, you can if you want to, like kind of a brief synopsis, but we have the last common ancestor 8 to 6 million years ago, and then we have all of the branches that branch off, and we eventually get Australopithecus, which is super important, and then we get Homo erectus, the first, so to speak, to walk out of Africa, walk out and back in, and all that. Which was, I won't ask you about how do we make distinct, humans from not, that's a debate about what makes sapiens different from others. But you say that in the book that Homo habilis might have been one of the earliest humans. And where in the tree, where in the line do you think, we'll talk about the Gulf in a minute, but where do you feel one of the early humans or the precursors to humans was the kind of quote unquote first to maybe use language, whether it was a very rudimentary kind of some grunts or some, kind of gestures of sorts? Like, where do we first kind of, we know chimps don't entirely do it, at least volitionally, but where do we first kind of see that with humans, I guess?
Yeah, well, I think it is in those very earliest Homo. And of course, you're quite right to say, say, when did they first use language? Well, what type of language? What was the nature of language at that time? I think even if we look at chimpanzees, we can see some aspects of language in there. They've got some intentionality of what their grunts and their barks, and they can use some flexibility. So there's some foundations there for language that we assume are in the common ancestor. We don't know very much about the common ancestor. We dated it between 8 and 6 million years ago because of the extent of the genetic differences between ourselves and chimpanzees. And we think it took 8 million years, between 6 and 8 million years ago, for that difference to emerge. And it's not until really after about 4.5 million years ago that the fossil record becomes better resolved. And that's with this remarkable clade of creatures called the Australopiths or Australopithecines that we know from East and South Africa, which had brains about the same size as chimpanzees, but they came in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, reflecting different lifestyles on what was emerging as a savanna environment as Africa was drying up and the forests were retreating. And one of those types seems to have begun a lifestyle where they're using stone tools, probably to take bits of flesh off carcasses left by hyenas and vultures after they've had their fill. And we're living in larger social groups, probably because of defensive nature on the savannah, and probably began communicating much more. And we call that species Homo habilis, with a larger brain than the others, brain ranging anything between 450 and 800 cc. And Homo habilis is often said to be the first member of the Homo genus, but that's highly debatable because in many ways its anatomy and its behavior was much more like the Australopithecines. And I think it's probably more accurate to say that Homo erectus, with its fully bipedal stance and its human stature and even further larger brain and design tools, is a better representative for the very earliest member of Homo. But nevertheless, I think Homo habilis was using a different type of verbal communication than we see chimpanzees using today, and that we infer for the common ancestor. Probably by needing to communicate more about predators in the environment, about food sharing, about accessing food and so forth, but not really using words as we're doing. I think they're using what I call iconic sounds, sense impressions, just to communicate the basics of information, but not the sort that have grammar and so forth. And that provides a foundation which then develops through the human genus in conjunction with other things happening. You know, when the body becomes adapted by bipedalism, that changes how we breathe, changes the length of the vocal tract, and that means we can make many more diverse range of sounds and control how they're made. Because that's one of the key differences between us and chimpanzees. Chimpanzees have great difficulty in a consistency of sounds because they haven't really got the nervous systems to be able to control their muscles in their thorax or their vocal tracts effectively. Bipedalism probably gave that control because we needed that breathing control for running and walking. So it had a knock-on effect on helping develop the vocal system. And that became selected in itself. So we see the evolution of language from those early starts of Australopithecines or Homo habilis as being really tied into other anatomical changes and changes in lifestyle.
I'm reminded, I had a long time ago, a book came out by Jeremy De Silva about bipedalism.
Yeah.
And I'm just reminded, I remember I was blown away by, the book's great and he's a really nice guy. And we had a nice conversation, but I'm just reminded again and again and again and again that yes, bipedalism sets us apart, but how it impacts all of the things we do as humans from other primates or the great apes is just it's just an ever increasing kind of wonder that how one thing can really be such a significant thing. It's truly remarkable.
I mean, in my other books, I've written about bipedalism having a massive impact on music because it gave us a control of our body, it gave us a sense of rhythm, enabled us to dance, it gave us a greater diversity of sounds. I really see bipedalism as being the origin of musicality in humans, but as also having this role in language as well. I think in this early stage of human evolution, it's very difficult to separate music and language. I think they're basically co-evolving at the same time. But yeah, it's a turning point, a massive turning point.
That's great. Yeah, that's wonderful. Maybe tell us about that gulf a little bit, as much as you can, or if you want to speculate. I guess the question I would have is, what would be the things you would want to know or you would suspect would be there? You talk about this in the fossil record between 1 million years and 350,000 years ago. There's this like kind of hole. There's this gap. We don't have a lot of stuff in the fossil record. What would we want to know, or what would be helpful, or what would we expect to find there that would help tell us some things?
Yeah, we'd have a bit of a gap on the fossil record because we can see that by, say, 1.5 million years ago, we've got Homo erectus with a brain size, getting up to about 2/3 of our modern human ones, getting up to about 1,000 cc in the largest ones. And we can also see by looking at the endocasts that they've got Broca's area there. Now, Broca's area was once thought to be the actual locus of language. We know now that it still plays an important role in language, but it plays an important role in lots of things as well. And they've got sort of an evolved vocal tract. It's still not quite the same as ours. So they've clearly, we're sure they've got some language ability. But then after about 1 million years ago, the fossil record becomes a bit more fragmented. After that time, we've got humans have spread out from Africa, and they're evolving in Europe, and they're evolving in Asia, and they're evolving in Africa, and they're returning to Africa, they're interbreeding. And the fossil records become rather fragmentary, and each of the fossils is rather fragmentary, and they become more difficult to date, because in the earlier periods, you can rely on various aspects of geological dating because you're dealing with large time periods. So anthropologists often call this the muddle in the middle. We don't really know how many species we've got. Some say there's as few as 3 or 4, and others say there's about 20 species. It's a really confusing period. But at the end of that, at around 400, 350,000 years ago, we've got the emergence of the early Neanderthals in Europe, And by 300,000 ago, the emergence of early Homo sapiens in Africa. And when we see those, they've both got significantly larger brains, equivalent to ours today. They've both got much more evolved vocal tracts. And they've both got more sophisticated technology, although still very different from ours. So in that rather unknown middle period, it would be a key time when some aspects of vocal ability continues to evolve, but we can't really track where it's happening, or it's happening in all these different species, how many there are, or just in one. And we don't really know if we've got ultimately one common ancestor of the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and if so, whether that's at 400,000 years, 800,000 years ago. It's lots up to grabs in that period at the moment, just because of fossil record is fragmentary. But by 300,000 years ago, it's becoming much more clearly defined. And we can really then begin to talk, I think, more effectively about the sorts of languages we should expect in our ancestors.
Yeah, it's a very interesting period because as you just say, after about 400, 350,000 years, then we start seeing all these different types of species. And so some have, I've talked to a few people, some have estimated that maybe there was as many as 11 or 12 living on the planet at the same time, and maybe not in the same place, but on the planet. And by 40,000 years, we it's only us, right? It's only us left over. There's debate on that too, but. When you talk about this, there's us, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Florensis, Denisovans, many different types. What was it, I guess the big question here is maybe hard to know. I mean, some of it with brain and vocal tract, but do we think that other species of humans, so to speak, were using more elementary forms of language, or is that really just unique to Homo sapiens?
Yeah, no, I'm sure they were. I mean, I think this has been, one of the great advances in our knowledge of the last 50 years or so. The fact that we haven't always been alone. That at the moment we are the only member of our Homo genus. But if you went back to 250 or 300,000. There's several different species around. That's an amazing thought, I think, that there's different types of humans around. And we can see that diversity is partly, you've got different evolution trajectories in different parts of the world, and humans are adapting different ways to different sorts of environments. So you've got the Neanderthals in Europe, who developed this rather robust, muscular bodies, partly reflecting their lifestyles of lots of physical hard labor, but also probably adapting to the cold environments of Northern Europe. And then the Denisovans, closely related to Neanderthals and us, who seem to have, who we think now had a gene that enabled them to help live in really high altitudes, like up on the Tibetan plateau, by helping protect them against shortage of oxygen. And then we've got the small-brained hominins, Homo naledi and Homo florensis. That seems to be an evolutionary trajectory where bodies are getting smaller and brains are getting smaller, complete opposite to which we normally think of how evolution works. And with Florensis, at least, that seems to be an adaptation to living in an island environment where there aren't large predators around. If there are no large predators, why bother about getting all the energy that you need for a large body and a large brain? So we've got this wonderful human diversity across the world at, say, 250,000 years ago. And then by 40,000 years ago, it's lost. And we become alone on the planet. And the big question is why that occurs. Now, I think there's two reasons for that. One is environmental change. From 20,000 years onwards, we've got global warming happening, and then dramatic global warming at the end of the Ice Age at around 11,500 years ago, with ecosystems around the world becoming massively destabilized. And I think that certainly impacted upon some of these other human populations. But then you've also got this phenomenon of Homo sapiens dispersing from Africa after around 70,000 years ago. And not only doing what Homo erectus did, getting into Europe and getting into Asia, but getting into Australia, getting into the Americas, which means building boats for one, crossing their Bering Straits in these extreme environments, just remarkable achievements. So they were different in some way to the other humans. And my own view is that they had fully modern language like we're using today, which made them outcompete the other humans. I don't think they fought them. We know they interbred with Denisovans and Neanderthals, and I suspect other species maybe. But over time, there was a competitive exclusion, just as we see in the modern world today with some species invading other animals' territories. That doesn't mean we're the only ones with language. I'm sure the Neanderthals and Denisovans and Neanderthals had forms of language, not quite, missing some elements of that we have today. And we can talk about those in a moment. But nevertheless, take Neanderthals, I'm sure they had large lexicons, there's some aspects of grammar, and there wasn't a Neanderthal language. There must be many different Neanderthal languages, because we know they were living in groups all the way from Western Europe across into bits of Asia, sometimes in quite separate populations. So there must have been linguistic diversity among Neanderthals, just as we have within us today. It's a mistake to think there was a single language evolving. Right from the start, there must be multiple different languages going in different trajectories, just as we have today.
Yeah, I definitely want to come to the language tree. I find that deeply fascinating. I think it is important, though, for people to realize that, much like if you watch a nature documentary and you see there's 7,000 species of beetles or whatever, it's like like most animals on the planet have multiple species. Like there's different types, and I think the same was true with humans. We just are the last ones to make it out, and so I think when you think about it that way, it kind of makes sense. But it is interesting to think about different types of humans. It is. It's a funny thing to think about nowadays, but of course, that's how it was.
One of the things that we do find difficult these days is that species concept itself. If you go back 20, 30 years ago, you'd have said, well, what's a species? Well, it's something that is isolated. It can't interbreed with other species. It can only breed within itself. We know now that's wrong. We know that we can look at lots of monkeys and they interbreed, different species interbreed, dogs, big dogs, they interbreed. And we know now that we interbred with the Neanderthals and with Denisovans, and we carry some of those genes. So the whole species concept has become a bit tricky, a bit fluid. It's difficult to actually define what a species is. But we do know that that human diversity now is so narrow, with one predominant, our genes are dominated by those of Homo sapiens. It's a remarkable phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get to the language tree and kind of the origins of it, which is cool, tell us, I guess, about language itself. You spend a few chapters here talking about this, about how we break up language as a system. And again, it's not a linguistics course, but we have a certain lexical way of understanding this: nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, grammatical, pronouns, prepositions, and then we have the morphemes and the phonemes. I guess the question I have is in our evolution, how did we come up with all of these ways of organizing these things, just kind of organically, and saying, well, we use it this way? How do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we ever came up with it in terms of it being invented. I think all these are emergent things that we at a later date label. Okay. Now, if we take language, we can break it, the language we're using today, we can break it into two key elements. There's words, and there's the rules by which we combine the words, the grammar. Now, in the individual word can be broken down into syllables or one syllable, and that syllable into phonemes. And phonemes are the ultimate sounds that we make. We combine them into syllables, combined into words. We combine words into sentences or phrases or utterances. And what becomes important there is the order in which we say the words. Typically, I say, dog bit the man is very different from the man bit the dog. It has a totally different meaning, but even though it's got exactly the same words. So we have words and grammar. And I think that for a great deal of time, actually, in looking at the evolution of language, the focus has been on the evolution of grammar, because that was thought to be the complicated problem. Chomsky particularly put huge focus on grammar, really. I think the evolution of words is as important, if not more important. And words come in different types. We have lexical words, things that mean things like banana and carrot and dog and proper names and so forth. And we have grammatical words that join them together, the ands and the ifs, the thers, the theirs. And then lexical words can also be broken down into abstract words, words that relate to things that we can't see, that may not exist, like God or love and so forth. And concrete words, things that we can see, like this table in front of me and your earphones and so forth. And then both those can be divided down to what I call iconic and arbitrary words. And this is a really important distinction. Most of our language as adults consists of arbitrary words. You know, a dog can be called a dog in English, a Hund in German, a chien in French, and so on and so forth. And you've got to learn those words and remember them. But there's also iconic words. The classic ones are onomatopoeias. You know, we use quack for the noise that a duck makes and so forth, and plop for a stone dropping into water. Iconic words, they were identified early on by writers in the Enlightenment about playing a role in the evolutionary language, and then they've sort of got shifted out of the way when everybody got concerned with grammar. But there's been a huge amount of research in the last decade, maybe a little bit more, on the role of iconic words in language learning by children. They're the easiest ones to learn. And this isn't just onomatopoeias. You know, we tend to use words for big, heavy, slow things tend to be made with big, heavy, deep vowels, like in English, hippopotamus or elephant or rhinoceros or enormous. And words for little, quick, small things tend to have quick, small words with high vowels like flea or bee or ant. And these have recently become recognized as probably playing a really important role in both language learning among children, and I think also for language evolution, because they are in effect the easiest words to grasp, because the sound of them matches in some way what they look like or what they sound like or how they move. So you can easily guess the meaning of them, and you can easily learn the meaning of them. Whereas learning the meaning of an arbitrary one is much more difficult. So we've got all these, how language breaks down, and we've got to work out which of those elements are the most critical in getting language going initially, which I think is iconic words, and which are most critical for making the sort of modern language we have today, which I'm sure are abstract words, grammatical words, and so forth. And that, you know, that's part of what I'm saying about language being a bit of a jigsaw. It's got lots of different pieces together. You've got to work out what order do you put them in to get from the chimpanzee grunt-likes, bark-likes sounds to the sort of complex words and utterances that we're making today.
I guess the question I have here, which will lead me into the next point, is about how do we, you're talking about these iconic words which seem to have some universality, but as you mentioned a little bit earlier, I mean, obviously we know there are thousands of languages around the world, and people will have different ways for saying the same, you know, nouns. You know, they'll say, or, you know, take something like love. You know, people will have, you know, 5 different ways to say that. Yeah. How does there this kind of proliferation of different ways to say the same thing, or to talk about a concept or an idea? How does that end up happening, where there's, you know, it's not just for one word to one word in a different language? How does it work that way? Yeah, well, you know, iconic words are pretty restrictive in a way, because if you have, say, an apple and a pear, now they look much the same, slightly different shape, but if you're just thinking about iconic words and you're using a word to capture the roundness or the color of it, difficult to distinguish between them. So the great advantage of arbitrary words is you can put much more detail in the world. So you can talk, as you say, not about love, but different kinds of love. And that also comes when you start adding words into phrases, romantic love, sexual love, and so on and so forth. So I think in human evolution, language probably began with iconic words, with Homo erectus, Homo habilis and Homo erectus, but then it reached a bit of a threshold, because there's only so much you communicate with them. You can't add detail. You can't talk about, distinguish between, say, a
a hyena and a lion easily by using an onomatopoeia and so forth. So there would have been selective pressure for arbitrary words. And I think once the brain had enlarged, you then have the memory capacity to start storing these and using them more effectively. So there's certainly pressure on words. But how do language differentiate? Well, it's partly through just through conversation, through constant exchange of language. As we're talking today, I pronounce things slightly different from you pronounce things. Sometimes you mishear what I say. Sometimes you'll pass a word on slightly differently. And if you scale it up, not from one conversation, but to billions of conversations happening within your speech community, things will gradually differentiate. And then as that population separates apart, you get different dialects developing. And if you lose contact entirely, over many years, you get actually different languages originating. So today, we can actually trace all our languages back to common origins. So for instance, English, Dutch, and German, they share lots of similar characteristics. We could take them back to a similar language that we might call a Germanic tradition. And then Spanish, Portuguese, French similarly do. And we call that back to a Romance tradition. But then they both combine, ultimately going back to, with about 400 other languages, to one that we think was spoken around 4,500 years ago that we called Proto-Indo-European in the Bronze Age. And it was from that language, by populations becoming separated, developing their own quirks and traditions, that there was a flourish, that there was this range of languages evolving that we have today: French, English, Spanish, and various languages spoken in Asia as well, in India as well. So we can go back, just like we do with human and animal evolution, to find common ancestors of language and trace them back. We can probably only get back to about 5,000 years. Beyond that, it just gets too problematic trying to work out what those languages may have been like. And people speculate what Indo-European would have been like, but how confident we can be when we're not entirely sure. So language, we've got two processes going on. We've got the evolution of the capability of language, but then also the evolution of languages. And for much of academic work, they've been kept separate. I think we combine them together, because right from the start, languages are evolving as that capacity for language is also evolving. And, it's still happening today. Our language is rapidly changing today with, the Oxford English Dictionary, has about 1,000 new entries in a year as words become more popular and some fall out of use. It's incredible. And in England, at least, recently we had COVID as a new word, we had Brexit as a new word, all sorts of new words constantly being invented. Yeah, it's amazing.
Right, yeah. Unfortunately, maybe I'm not going to make political statements, but maybe those words shouldn't have been in there. Hopefully, it's unfortunate we have to capture these things.
Well, I know, but they give us good examples, really. Yeah, I agree with you.
Right, exactly. So, I was going to ask you about this. So, I mean, you have a really beautiful kind of tree diagram in the book, and you talk about Proto-Indo-European, which, if I recall, correct me if I'm wrong here, this is 4,500, 5,000 years ago. Is sort of where we get the Anatolian hypothesis, right? That there's this out of central Anatolia, modern day Turkey, you start to see all of this spread of different languages. That this is the really big like nexus point, or the big juncture where we get this all these languages. Is that about right? This is a critical place and moment.
It's been much debated for both good and worse. I mean, if you go back to the 1920s and 1930s, the National Socialists, Nazis in Germany, they were claiming that Indo-European was spoken by the original Germanic tribes in Germany. And it was the spread of those Germanic tribes that spread Indo-European language, in fact, all of European culture across the whole continent. And therefore, Nazis took some of their justification for their their ideology from what they believed Indo-European language was, the original Germanic language. Now, we know now that that's entirely wrong. So we have had different theories, and some lead to really serious political consequences. Colin Renfrew argued that Indo-European emerged from this spread of farmers out of Anatolia and the Near East, coming into Europe, and that Indo-European developed in, whether it was in Southwest Asia or in Anatolia, but it spread to those farmers into Europe. Nowadays, we have a slightly different version of that. We actually think it originated over in the Caucasus, in where Ukraine is now, and spread with Bronze Age people who spread both westward across Europe and also eastward into Southern Asia. So there's lots of different theories actually where Indo-European came from, but that's the current and the best guess at the moment. But of course, as that language spreads, there's lots of different culture and spreading with it. Bronze Age people brought metalwork into the Neolithic communities, and they also brought lots of their genes as well, because there's been a constant replacement of populations as well. So looking at the spread and the evolution of language becomes very much tied up with the spread of culture generally, new lifestyles and so forth, as it still does. We one of the great drivers of language today is the IT revolutions changing our language. We use the word cloud now entirely differently to how we would have used it 5 or 10 years ago. So technology drives language, and language drives technology in an amazing way.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, you mentioned even the precursors to that is the Altaic and the Uralic languages that have even much older. I was thinking about this, and this stuff starts to get really hard to really know, I'm assuming. But what do we do with older languages or things like that, where we have Sumerian and Old Turkic and Syriac and Assyrian, Akkadian, or Aramaic? Yeah. These are some very old languages that I think are either precursors to Indo-European base or maybe around there. What do we do with these quote-unquote dead languages, meaning that they're not really spoken anymore in modern day? How do we understand, again, it's sort of in this Fertile Crescent area, you see a lot of this stuff. Yeah. What do we make of this?
Well, one thing we need to do is care for them, learn about them, document them. Some of the extinct languages can be fitted into the trees that we have. So Latin is an extinct spoken language, although it's still, people still learn to write and so forth. That can be fitted into the Indo-European tradition. But if you go much earlier than that into the original Assyrian and going even back into the first written languages, they don't particularly fit into these trees. We don't know how they fit in. And without this, we don't know how, not knowing how they're pronounced, we can't really relate them to modern day languages at all. But that, we have them because, that's another great transition in the evolution of language that I didn't really write about in my book very much, which is when it moves from being just spoken to actually being written. Because that really changes how we use language. It changes the value of language in a sense, because we can record thoughts for posterity. We can read what somebody wrote 5,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia and what they're interested in, what they're writing about. We don't know how it's pronounced, but we can actually read that. And that tells a lot about that society today. But it also has a function of sort of rather freezing language in a sense, freezing the meaning of words. And that's why we get the debates today so much about language, where some people say, oh, the apostrophe, we should always use apostrophe exactly in the same way as it always has been. And people think there's very fixed rules. And that idea really comes from writing, I think, rather than the fluidity of language when we speak, when it's got a much more rapid pace of change. Written languages changes much more slowly than spoken language. As we all know, when we speak, we don't really use many grammatical rules when we speak. Right. But if you don't use them writing, people won't publish your book, So, or they do if they want to publish that sort of book, but not the ones that I write. So that distinction between written language and spoken language is really fascinating in itself in terms of language evolution. But today
that's a great point.
Today we have probably about 7,000 languages in the world. They're disappearing at an alarming rate. I reckon if we went back, 50,000 years, there must have been hundreds of thousands of languages, I think, with people living in smaller communities, and just a much greater linguistic diversity. And the loss of linguistic diversity today, I think, is as great loss as great a loss of biological diversity, I think. We're narrowing down how we think of being human. And I think that's a trap that some people like Chomsky fell into, actually, because they based all their theories on English or Indo-European languages, rather than some of these really, to us, strange languages spoken in, say, Polynesia, which have very limited range of sounds and loads of different sort of phonemes and different ways of combining words and much greater use of gesture. So from those, we see linguistic diversity is huge and must have been much greater in the past than we have it today.
Yeah. It is. I love the point that you make about speaking and writing, and then the idea that thousands of years ago there were more languages, which is again such a marvel to think about. You talk about the physical components of making and forming and expressing words and sentences in our body. Air going from the lungs to the trachea to the larynx. Could you maybe just briefly give us the kind of overview of kind of how this starts, the kind of the physicality of speaking, I guess, and using language in our body, and what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean that's a real fascinating thing in itself, and people could and have and should write just books about this amazing. It's one of the miracles of how we do it. I mean, how do you make a word? If I say, "Hi, Xavier," how on earth I'm doing that? Well, clearly there's lots of brain activity in giving me my impulse to say that, although often that's purely unconscious. But basically, I'm generating air from my lungs, and I'm forcing it up through my trachea, up into my through my vocal cords, through my mouth, and I'm expelling air in various little short pulses that have particular wavelengths that somehow your ears pick up. And your mechanisms in your ear translate those pulses of air, those sound waves, back into electrical circuits, into your brain, which then can decode them and to understand what I intended to say. So it's a two-process thing. Me converting ideas of words into sound waves, and you decoding those sound waves back into words, and we end up with the same words. So this process, I'm forcing the air through my trachea, and as it comes into the vocal tract, into the mouth, it's then the particular shape I'm making of my mouth, maneuvering my tongue, my palate, and my teeth to produce different types of sounds. Sounds which are plosives when I say P or F. And the vowel sounds that vary whether I've got my mouth open wide, whether I'm making them from the back of the mouth or the front of the mouth. And we do this all entirely unconsciously. And it's partly because our vocal tracts are quite different to chimpanzees, and this is partly why they can't really make speech-like sounds. If you look at an infant chimpanzee, an infant baby, they're quite similar. They look quite similar. But as chimpanzees mature, they grow quite a long snout, and it gives this large oral cavity with very flat tongues that rather disconnects that from their trachea, from the rest of their vocal tract. And it rather limits them in their flexibility, their control, their diversity of the sounds they can make. But we have our sound chambers as a combination of our vertical component and a horizontal component, with a tongue playing a critical role in the middle of being able to combine them, separate them, change the shape of them, so we can make this wide range of sounds by manipulating all our muscles. We're using the muscles in our chest, in our thorax, in our necks, in our cheekbones to constantly change the shape of the mouth as we're saying these words. And that's part of the miracle. The other one is, of course, with the hearing, how you decode these. going back into the brain. So that is all an absolutely fascinating thing. And that partly then relates to trying to track through human evolution, where not only the vocal tract, but the auditory tract evolved. And the way we've been able to do that is partly by, in that our ears have tiny little bones called ossicles in. And the shape of those ossicles influence how the types of sounds we can hear and how they're changed and converted. And we know that chimpanzees are rather different shaped ossicles than we do as humans. And Neanderthals had, again, slightly different to those that we have themselves. Then also recently we've been able to use CT scans for looking at ancient skulls, for looking at the cochlea as well. So we're getting a really good understanding of the anatomy of the ear, and that's been one of the great advances. And it's shown that certainly by 350,000 years ago, although the auditory tract was slightly different, it was probably as complex, as sophisticated as ours today. So not only could Neanderthals make a wide range of sounds, they could also hear and decode a wide range of sounds. And that has been a key thing in saying, yep, the Neanderthals did have language, not just a little bit advanced grunts and barks, but a really sophisticated form of language. Although one that I still think was a bit different to those of modern humans.
You mentioned the brain. Where it's again. This is. I mean, there's books written on this. There's textbooks on this, right? It's a very complicated kind of production here. But in your point, you mentioned it earlier. A lot of the times, this is one point I want to emphasize here. For a long time, people thought about Broca's, Wernicke's areas, these two main language centers in the left hemisphere of the brain, one predominantly for receptive language, one for expressive language. Yeah. And, you can even mention, Brodmann area 44, 45, these very specific areas of the brain. That's all true. Yeah. But what we've understood with neuroscience over the past, 10, 15 years is the interconnectedness of the brain, meaning it's not one area, one thing. It's languages all over the brain. Yeah. It might have certain focal points, but could talk about that, about how do you see generally or the gestalt of how language works in our human brains? Yeah. I mean, this has been a sea change we've learned over the last perhaps 30 years or so. As you say, once, Broca's area clearly is important language, and once Broca's and Wernicke's areas and the connection between them was thought, that's it really, it's all in the left hemisphere. Then from the 1960s onwards, various types of brain scanning was developed. And wow, actually language is all over the brain. Maybe still predominantly in the left hemisphere, although some people have language predominantly in the right hemisphere. And we've learned two things really, that these organs like Broca's area, or parts of the brain like Broca's area, don't only do language, they do lots of other things as well. And one of the interesting things is they're become particularly used in tool making, which suggests maybe there was a connection between evolution, tool making, language in human evolution. But we also see that other parts of the brain are also playing a role in language, such as the cerebellum, subcortical areas, which plays several different roles in language. And we also see that language isn't exactly the same way in different people. Language isn't instantiated in the brain in exactly the same way in every single person, has some differences. But the most amazing thing, I think, that has been realized in perhaps just the last, 5 years, maybe decade, is where we store words. Because it's been shown that words, or rather the concepts related to words, these are all over the brain. They're almost in every little nook and cranny. We find them. So our brains the whole brain is some sort of language device. I don't think anybody really understands how it works, but I think we can appreciate the complexity of it and the beauty of it as well. And I think the fact that we've got all these words and clusters of words around the brain is really interesting, because it is the connections, how these different areas are connected through these neural networks we have, which really deliver all these separate entities as this modern fluent language that we have.
So it's having those brain structures and there's a connection between them, which are really critical. And I think that also makes a difference between what early humans had, like Homo erectus and Neanderthals, and what we have, because I think our brains are much more interconnected than those of our ancestors and relatives in early human evolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because you mentioned earlier about how there's been so many languages and language changes and evolves over time. I guess I'm curious about your ideas here on this, because there's obviously language that changes organically. Just a bunch of people in one place, years and years and years and years. And then just the downstream effect, it's like, oh, this, you see this in the English language, you see this in many, many languages. What do you think about, I guess, when people try to intentionally, very quickly change language for whatever reason or purpose? I'm not saying that you have to be the oracle telling us when you can and can't change language, but how do you feel, I guess, in terms of the process of how we use language? You mentioned many things, that it was, big cultural components, that there's many, many different elements of language. What do we think about this idea of how language changes, whether more forcefully and directly or slowly and organically over time? How do you think about this?
Well, there's clearly several processes happening. One is just the principle of least effort. I mean, we all get lazy. Words are continually being eroded and shortened. And if we find a word that captures something, we adopt it. So we do that unconsciously from other people when they hear it. So there's that. There's also the whole thing of social status. Sometimes we adopt words because, hey, they sound really cool, they sound great, they enable us to connect with other people. We want to talk like them because they are people who admire. So there's our inherent laziness, there's our inherent desire for social status, or not social status, but to connect with other people. So we like to adopt the phrase that other people use, those who admire, who we want to be seen to be similar to. So those processes happening. What's really interesting are, of course, those people who deliberately innovate new words. Now, it's quite rare that we do, but we hear about, Shakespeare made up so many words and so forth. And it's not only words, it's actual phrases. And I suspect really from quite early in Homo sapiens evolution, probably from 100,000 years ago, orators, people who could speak really effectively and coin a phrase, actually acquired quite a high status at those particular times. Because we do seem to have a love of language. One of our great things is our joy of words. We love jokes. We love puns. We love using a really cool metaphor. Somehow, sometime in evolution, we've had that embedded to us. And I think, our love of different word games, some people play Scrabble or crosswords or Wordle and things like that. That must come from some instinctive desire to enjoy the fun and the games with words and how new words are invented. So there's the laziness, there's desire for social approval from those who we admire. There's the joy and the fun with words. Somehow, for some reason, we like that. And then there's words that are invented that really drive things very effectively. And that overlaps with the idea about words, and they're not just for communicating, they're used for thinking as well. And sometimes we need the words to think about complex concepts. And one thing I emphasize in my book is we need metaphors to think about complex concepts. And without the ability to have metaphors, we actually constrain our level of thought, and we make really hard technological developments difficult, and difficult to grasp abstract ideas unless we're using metaphors. And that goes back to that old connectivity within the brain. So, yeah, it's a combination of all different things happening. But metaphor becomes really important at times. And we enjoy metaphors, and we use them constantly and forget that we use them. But without metaphors, I don't think science and so forth would have progressed.
Yeah, the beauty and aesthetics of language is quite spectacular. It's interesting because You do talk about it in the book, which is really nice. This relationship between language and emotions and thoughts, and there's definitely this relationship. Many people have talked about this in different contexts of thinking and speaking, right? There's this very much that kind of connection, I guess, intrinsically for us as individuals. I do think, though. I mean, obviously, you first person that came to mind when I was reading your book was, Wittgenstein's, language games. He talked a lot about this, as a philosopher. But you have a lot of, so maybe more of the postmodern thinkers that it seems that, when I think of someone like Derrida or Foucault or even other folks, they put I feel, overemphasis on language, that you can only know things or concepts based on the which I think it's just totally discrediting how things are in the body or how things are non-verbally or how things are. Do you feel that in terms of when we're trying to talk about philosophical concepts or ideas or all of these things, that we put too much value and weight on language, like we can overemphasize it too much?
I think we can. I think you're right. I think one thing we've got to remember, that the basic role of language is for communication. That's the fundamental role. Mm-hmm. Right. We do use language for thinking about difficult ideas, but it's not the only way we think and grasp difficult ideas. We grasp them through our bodily experience as well, through physicality, through the movement of the body and so forth, through what we see and what we sense. So it's easy to put too much emphasis on language because we think, language is unique to us. It must answer all of our evolutionary questions and everything about being human, which I don't think it does at all. I don't think it does at all. I think it does help us think about complex ideas, but we've got to reach a bit of a balance. Those who argue that language is just for communication, I think are wrong, because clearly it's not that. Those who says that language defines us as being humans are wrong, because I think we can go back and look at Homo erectus and Neanderthals, and even Homo habilis, who, yes, they are humans, and it's wrong to say they aren't humans, but their linguistic abilities are likely to have been much more limited to us, but yet they were doing wonderful things. They were they're living in all sorts of different environments. Sure. They were making all sorts of complex tools. They live in complex society. They did that without much language. And I think that's a lesson we need to remember. So I think you're right. We don't want to get too hung up on it as the defining character of being human. It changes the type of human you are with having language, but you can be a perfectly able human with limited language abilities. And we know that, our language abilities vary with ourselves within populations today immensely. And some of the most brilliant scientists and thinkers, they're not particularly articulate. They don't come up with grand phrases and so forth. And yet some of the the most stupid people can be wonderful orators. They can come out with wonderful phrases and they can bring people along with them, but actually they're pretty stupid, okay? So the relationship between language, intelligence, society, emotional being is really fluid, I think.
Yeah, even just to use as a fun example, sometimes when I watch film, I know some directors will say, there's too much exposition in film. Yeah. There's too much. It's too much. There's so much dialogue. And sometimes it works. It depends on the type of film. Yeah. But a lot of the times with a visual image, with moving pictures, literally, that's what should do all the explaining. That should get your mind to really think. And it's, so minimal dialogue is can be really, really important. I mean, the first movie that comes to mind is, probably Dunkirk, which was a more recent movie. But you don't need all this dialogue explaining, okay, here's what happened and here's where they were and here's all this. You understand all the context and the things. So anyways, there's many ways we can communicate.
Another case language. Of that, sometimes the most emotionally fulfilling relationship you can have with another person is when you're just sitting quietly with them with a little bit of dialogue for some time. Yeah. And that can be a really tense, meaningful experience. Whereas if you're having this ongoing chatter constantly, that can be rather oppressive, actually. You think, oh my goodness. Yeah. So I think quietness and using words carefully and shrewdly
Yeah.
and not over much is a really sophisticated
Mm-hmm.
use of language. Yeah.
Yes, this is something I'm still learning how to do, hopefully better and better each year. But yes, as I've gotten older, I've learned to try and minimize, which is maybe ironic because, I have so many conversations with people on the podcast. So maybe that's the irony there. But the last question is, I guess, the future of language. Obviously, language continues to evolve and stuff, and I know this is sort of a kind of tired question of sorts, but it is a kind of think a relevant one. Is, there's lots of discussion about machine learning and AI and all these things,
Yeah.
and what that's doing to language, right? How that's changing how we're seeing language. I guess just generally the future of language, but how do you see this kind of technology impacting, for better or for worse, or more neutrally, however you want to say it? What do you think is the impact here?
That's a really hard question. Because on one hand, it could be really profound in a sense. On the other hand, it might actually enhance our language abilities by taking away some of the unnecessary words and communication we do. So we focus language down on more what words can do that artificial machines perhaps cannot. I think there's my big worry with language is not so much that it's the loss of linguistic diversity in the world. At the moment we've got 7,000 languages. So many of them have got a few speakers left. And, the big prediction is that in X hundreds of years, there'll probably only be 4 or 5 languages left that the majority of people are speaking. So that's a worrying thing. Quite how AI is, and not only that, but social media as well is affecting the way we speak and the way we think about language is a really challenging one. I just see it could go various different ways, and I don't actually think I've got a good answer to that. What do you think? I'd love to know your views on that.
I think it's I think it's sort of the same. I think we'll see some positives and I think we'll see some negatives. I guess the thing that always worries me about this is I think some of the stuff with social media and just the kind of the internet generally how it is today is things are almost too fast. We're kind of in an information overload and I think we're always trying to play catch up on the last thing or things will happen and then they're gone after 48 hours. And so I wish things were a little bit slower on this front. But so I do worry about, linguists talk about this stuff, but there's interesting ways in which each generation has a slang and they have a vernacular and that stuff's always fun culturally to kind of look at. But, I just wonder what it is about downstream, how that continues. And I don't really have a strong opinion about it, but it is something observably like, oh, okay, what is the impact that has? And unknown at this point.
I guess it's going to make language evolve more quickly. Because there's just much more communication going on. So as we were talking about, how does language evolve? Well, because you get lazy, because you want to impress people and so forth. All of that is being accelerated because there's just millions, billions more conversations going on all the time. So I think language will evolve more quickly. Unfortunately, at the same time, it'll lose its bit of diversity, I think, maybe. And of course, you might say we lose also the art of conversation, really, of just sitting down quietly, just 2 or 3 people talking without any of these computer raids, without anybody looking at the phone and things like that. We might lose some of that art. I suppose ultimately I'm an optimist there. I think something good will come out of it in terms of how language develops. But that's just a gut feeling, really. I think when you look back at the whole evolutionary line, I imagine people would said the same things when somebody invented the first cuneiform script. Say, hey, how's that going to change how language is? And people say, oh, it's going to be a disaster, or it's going to be wonderful. And so I'm not sure if it's different in kind to that. It might be. I think we'll know probably within 10 years or so.
No, I agree with that.
We're living at a fascinating moment in history.
Yeah, no, I agree. I fully agree with you there. Well, Steven, this was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this. This was such a wonderful conversation about not only language, but language in different ways and disciplines throughout time. And your book is masterful, and so I'm really thankful for you coming on and talking all about it. It's been a real blast.
Well, it was so kind of you to invite me. It's great to be part of Converging Dialogues. It's a wonderful thing you deliver here for everybody, and it's been great talking to you, and thanks for reading my book so carefully and be able to talk about it in such detail. It's wonderful. Really enjoyed it.
Yes, so thank you.